Life isn't always sunshines and daisies. Sometimes you have car problems, sometimes you step on a Lego, and sometimes your wife leaves you like 3 chips left in the entire bag. However, none of this compares to the ultimate first world problem: your internet going down. Yeah, I know, too spooky, but there is a solution to it. Just buy 2. Now I know that's not the coolest or most elite hacker way to do this, but honestly, it's the most logical one and a pretty common one at that. I actually used to run a dual WAN setup at my old house in failover mode using pfSense, and it worked pretty well. If you're interested in that video, link up here. And today, we're going to be doing something extremely similar, although we're going to be using TP Link Omada, which in my opinion is much easier. So let's take a look. The first thing we're going to do is actually talk about the hardware I'm using, and it is what I call the Omada short stack. I did a dedicated video on this, link in the description below, but essentially what it is a dedicated Omada controller. You can virtualize it if you want, then a router, a switch, and an access point. Pretty much the bare minimum and enough to get you going even if you want to do a dual WAN configuration. So we aren't going to cover the entire setup process for all of your Omada hardware. That's kind of outside of the scope of this video. So we're just going to assume that you have all of your hardware configured and it's accessible via the Omada software. We're also going to assume that the router you went with is capable of running a multiple WAN configuration. Now, when you hop into your Omada dashboard for the first time, your router won't be configured to run in multiple WAN mode. We're going to have to fix that. Now, you'd assume that you would go over here into devices, go into your router, and mess with the configurations to get this set up, but actually you don't. Go straight down here into the settings, go into wired networks, and into internet. This is where you're going to configure all of your WAN settings. And by default, you will only have one WAN configured, and here you can see I have 2. Guess what that means? Yeah, we're running in dual WAN mode. Now you can see we have a dedicated WAN port as well as 2 ports that can be configured to run in WAN or in LAN mode. Just check the ones that you want to use to run in WAN mode, and you can even run a USB modem if you want to use kind of a cellular hotspot type deal. So once you have at least 2 checked, you will be able to run in dual WAN mode. Now there are some more settings, so let's talk about it. The first thing you'll see is this online detection interval setting, and what this is doing is adjusting the frequency that the Omada software checks for each interface to be online. I set this to the shortest possible, which is a minute. I wish there was something even shorter, honestly, but the fastest you can do it is 1 minute. Then moving down, you can see where we can edit each WAN interface individually. Now, I've essentially left both of them default. Your use case may be different. You may want to make some modifications to these settings. Add a description, change the connection type to static. Even in advanced settings, you can specify a DNS server for each WAN if you want them to be different. The MTU, you can even specify a VLAN tag here if you have some niche scenario where you need that. But in our case, everything is default. We don't have IPv6 enabled. We're using the default MAC address. You can customize one if you need MAC address spoofing, but again, all of this is left default in my situation. And moving down, this is where we get into the fancy stuff, which is load balancing. So by default, this link backup will be off. I'll turn mine off. You'll see what I have set up in a second, but first thing you'll see is this load balancing wait. This is actually really cool. So what this is doing is specifying a wait to distribute the connections that come in. So for example, if you have 2 WANs where one is fiber gigabit up and down, and your other one is maybe cable where you're only getting 100 up and down, maybe you don't want those to be equally load balanced. The fiber is essentially 10 times faster, so maybe you want to change it to where it's a 10-to-1 ratio. And doing that will allocate the weight of the connections coming in to where it's going to try as hard as it can to essentially balance it to that ratio that you specify. The next setting is application optimized routing. I would suggest you have this enabled. You can read the description here, but essentially what that's doing is making sure that connections that are coming from the same outside server will always be routed through the same WAN. Just in the event that there are certain applications that are going through separate WANs that might cause issues, checking this box will help to alleviate that. And you can leave it at that and have your nice ratio load balancing setup, good to go, and that be the end. But another cool feature that a lot of people will use is this link backup. Once you enable it, it will give you more settings to dive into. So essentially, this is saying, let's not only have load balancing, but let's have backups. So what it's going to ask you for is a primary WAN and a backup WAN. You can specify multiple primary WANs, but only one backup WAN. Now, in our case, we only have two, so it's pretty easy. Our original WAN is the primary, and our WAN/LAN 1 port is our backup. Then the next setting, backup mode. This one is kind of confusing. I didn't really understand it at first. I don't think the little infographics right here really do a good job of explaining it, but essentially setting it to link backup will switch over connections once the primary fails to the backup, and then use that until there's an issue moving forward. And essentially it'll make sure that you're in an always online configuration. The next one is always link primary, which will essentially do the same thing. It will fail over from the primary to the backup, but once that primary is back up, it'll transfer all the connections back up to the primary. So everybody's use case will be different. In my case, I'd rather it use the primary because my primary is much faster. So I'm going to leave it on always link primary. Your use case may be different. And then the last setting is telling it whether you want it to fail over when one of the primaries fails or if all of the primaries fail. In our case, we only have one, so there's no difference. But if you have multiple primary WANs, you'll want to take a look at this setting. Now, once you have that, just click apply and it's ready to go. You can check it by going over into devices, clicking on your router, and then making sure that you are seeing two WAN connections. So by the infographic, you can see this little earth is specified as the WAN, and you can see that we are running two WAN ports. You can also see, depending on how your dashboard is set up, you will now have two WAN tabs for your ISP load. So now we have it set up in our failover backup mode. Let's show you how that actually works. So what I'm going to do, go over here and we'll see what's my IP. Now, I have this blurred out, obviously, because I don't want you guys seeing my public IP address. I'll give you a little taste of the last 3 digits, just so you can see when it changes. And this is essentially running off of my primary WAN. Now, what we're gonna do is actually go into my modem settings and essentially fail over the entire WAN interface. Okay, here we go. The WAN configuration is now failed. We should not have access, and it looks like we don't. Yep, so like I said, every minute it's gonna check, so this may take a bit to fail over. So let's give it some time. Yes, I know. So it still hasn't failed over yet. Here you can see why. I'd like it if we could go even lower than 1 minute. All right, and here you can see we have internet back. And if we go over here and check to see what my new IP is, you can see it is something completely different that is on my second WAN. So that worked. Now, we do have to check the setting to make sure that it actually fails back to the primary. Fails back, is that even the right terminology? That it goes back to the primary once the primary is back up. So let's go ahead and bring the primary back up. All right, the primary is back up. Let's give it a couple of minutes and see that it'll actually change back over to the primary WAN. And just like that, my IP has been switched back over to the primary WAN without doing essentially anything. Now, one cool thing I want to show you is the ability to now do custom policy routing. So let's go into settings, down to transmission, routing, and policy routing. You can see here I have one rule, and what this rule is essentially doing is saying my iPhone, anytime it's connected to the internet, automatically route it through my secondary WAN. And this is just a demo example. You can do it by an entire interface or network. You can do it by a list of devices. You can do it for whatever. I just have it for my iPhone for demonstration purposes. So let's go in here and take a look at what I've actually done. I've given it a name, PIA, because my secondary WAN is actually running through my PIA VPN, which is convenient. Obviously enabled, protocols all, and selecting the WAN. So here you can see we've selected our secondary WAN, which means that all the traffic will be routed through this WAN. Now the source is going to be the devices that you want to specify. In our case, we have an IP group called iPhone, and all that is a subnet of my static IP for my iPhone with the subnet of 32, which means it's only a single IP. So I don't know why you can't see it in here. If I go over into profiles, groups, if we look at iPhone, you'll see we just have the static IP with the subnet of 32. You can change that. I do wish that Omada allows you to just specify an IP range instead of doing an IP address and then specifying a subnet. That's kind of confusing, especially for people who don't know 32, 31, 30, how many specific IPs that takes up. Extremely confusing. Please change this. But you can add multiple, you can specify a larger range, you can do whatever. But going back into our rule, you'll see we've said that we want to use that IP group, which again is only our single device, route it through the secondary WAN to IP group any, which is what you'll want to specify 99% of the time if you're doing this policy-based routing on a specific WAN. So here I'll show you, I'm connected to the same SSID as my laptop, checking my IP address. We are getting our secondary WAN IP address. And when we go over here, you'll see that we are getting our primary, which makes sense because this laptop isn't included in that policy rule, but this iPhone is. And I did skip over an important setting. You can specify if you'd like this rule to fail over to another WAN. I have this disabled. Obviously, your use case may be different. This would be a good use case if you have a device in your network that you want to route over a secondary WAN. Maybe it's your VPN, and maybe you're downloading music and movies from some super legal website, and you want to make sure that if PIA goes down, it doesn't fail over to your primary WAN where they'll get mad at you for acquiring those legal movies. So that might be a use case for this. Now again, this is a very simple configuration, but honestly, it's really simple to set up in Omada. I do really like that about the Omada setup versus pfSense, where I've done it before on pfSense. You might have more flexibility over there, but it's much more complex. Here, everything is laid out for you. There are some settings that I think could use some better wording, but in general, it was extremely easy to get set up. Now, I know my use case isn't super fancy, but I do think that what I showed you today can be applied to many of you out there who are wanting to set up a dual WAN configuration in Omada. So I do have links to the hardware I use down in the description below. There are affiliate links if you want to check them out. I do highly recommend Omada hardware, so go and check that out if you're interested and want to do some kind of setup like me. But that is it. I hope you found this video entertaining. Maybe you found it a little bit informative. If you did, drop a like. If you like content like this or like looking at my beard and bald head or something like a weirdo, then be sure to subscribe. It helps the channel out a ton. But I want to give a huge shout out to all of my Patreons and my YouTube members. You guys make all of this stuff possible with your generous donations to the channel. I sincerely appreciate it. But that is it. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're still here, then thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.